Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Universal Peace Federation. My name is Ray Lapalkin, and our program today will be with one of our associations, IMAP, which is the International Media Association for Peace. And IMAP is an association of media professionals working together for the achievement of a world of lasting and sustainable peace. IMAP recognizes the vital role that journalists play in guarding against totalitarianism and supporting the expansion of freedoms around the world. IMAP represents a worldwide professional network of journalists who support a socially responsible and moral media to convey accurate content, address the challenges of our time based on the highest principles of ethical journalism, and understanding that universal values are key elements of a world of peace. And our program today is titled Critical Northeast Asian Issues, and this is part one of part two. And this is an interview discussion with Mr. Doug Bandow. He is the senior fellow at the Cato Institute, which we sometimes call a think tank. It's a policy research organization, and he'll be giving some of his insights on the situation in Northeast Asia. Of course, we always talk about China, the Korean Peninsula with North Korea and their nukes, and just the whole dynamics of that region with Japan, and then extending, of course, down into the South Pacific with the Philippines and the waterways that China is somehow trying to supplant the freedom of the waterways on some of these channels. So please enjoy this program.
Very happy to have you here. We're very fortunate today. We have as our special guest, Mr. Doug Bandow. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. A long time ago, he was a special assistant to President Reagan, and he imprinted on foreign policy and civil liberties issues. He does a lot of writing. You see his articles published in Fortune magazine, National Interest, Wall Street Journal, and of course, our favorite, the Washington Times, New Republic, Newsweek, Time. He's been everywhere, the Washington Post. He won the H.L. Mencken Award, which is a very coveted prize for people who have a certain very wicked sense of humor. And he won that for editorial writing, so I'm quite envious of him. Mr. Bandow is kind of a hero. He's in and out of a lot of places, been to North Korea a couple of times. We're very happy to have him with us. And joining us also today in a conversation will be Dr. Michael Jenkins, who is the president of Universal Peace Federation International. And he is also the chairman of Washington Times Holdings, which is the company that owns the Washington Times news organization. Good to have both of you with us. And I will turn it over to Michael Jenkins to kind of get this started. And I believe he's going to ask Mr. Bandow to speak first. Welcome,
yes,
both of you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Larry. We're very happy to be on our weekly program, 2 p.m. every Tuesday. And our focus is on Northeast Asia, issues with North and South Korea, China, and the 6 parties that were involved in the talks in 2005. We're happy that Mr. Bandow from the Cato Institute is here. Doug, go ahead. Take 20 minutes or more to give us some perspective on how you see the Northeast Asia situation, especially focused on North-South Korea, China, Taiwan, and anything about the current administration you want to observe. Thank you. Welcome, Doug Bandow.
Well, thanks, Larry and Michael. It's a great pleasure to be on. I mean, that's quite an open field to be talking about. Obviously, if we're looking at Northeast Asia, there are any number of issues going on. I think in many ways, what's most striking, especially having recently traveled there and talked to people there, is to some degree the uncertainty that we are in a time of, frankly, some danger of transition, of change, and nobody's quite sure where it's all going. And that I think that makes everybody very nervous. Taiwan may be the hottest spot. I think in many ways, probably more dangerous, more problematic than North Korea these days. We saw with Nancy Pelosi's visit. We've had subsequent visits by other members of Congress, a very strong Chinese reaction. question about American military involvement, and then the role of the Republic of Korea and Japan in all of that. So, Taiwan manages to bring everything in. So when you're talking about Taiwan, you also have to talk about China, also have to talk about Japan and South Korea, you have to talk about the United States. And once you've done that, then you raise issues of North Korea and everyone else. So you're kind of got the whole region. I think that the real concern there is that, Nancy Pelosi made what I think in many ways was for her the swan song, presumably, of her speakership. The election is a month away, or a little more than a month away in the U.S. for the off-year elections for Congress. Her presumption is, most people presume, she won't be speaker after that election. Could be a surprise. I mean, we've occasionally the party in power picks up seats, but it's pretty rare. So I think in many ways she did that not so much out of policy, but rather for her own satisfaction. She's long been a critic of China. But the question of why go there when she did, really the only obvious reason is the fact that if she's not going to be speaker after January, this is a time to do it. And to my mind, the danger with that was she ignores the impact on the Chinese. The Chinese talk a lot and will complain about a lot. So there's no surprise they weren't happy about that. But my conversations with Chinese diplomats and members of the international department, which is in a sense the foreign policy wing of the Chinese Communist Party, suggest that a very deep unease in Beijing at the moment, where in essence people are becoming convinced that both the US and Taiwan are working together to change policy and to move towards separatism and independence for Taiwan. Whether or not that's true isn't the issue, it's what the Chinese believe. And the fact they believe that suggests, I think we're going to be in for a rougher time, that we're likely to see kind of the new normal is going to be more Chinese military intrusions, more Chinese threats, more Chinese activity. China doesn't want a war, but we underestimate how important it is for them in terms of nationalism, and then from their standpoint, security, to ensure that Taiwan doesn't float off as kind of a member of the U.S. orbit with U.S. troops and U.S. presence, as opposed to being Chinese. So I'm very concerned about that if we underestimate that the Chinese may accelerate kind of their activities, that is, if they perceive the U.S. and Taiwan are moving ahead in a direction they don't like, they may decide they might have to move faster than they want to. And that brings in, I think, both South Korea and Japan, both of which are very important. The U.S. would like them to be all in if there's a military action. The U.S. is, something like 7,500 miles away from Taiwan, a long ways. Very hard to project power that far. China's 100 miles away. It has, 40 or so bases it could use in terms of any combat involving Taiwan. So the U.S. would do a lot better if it's able to rely on its allies and friends in the region. The problem, of course, is if you're Japan or South Korea and authorize U.S. use of bases in those countries, you automatically turn yourself into a target. China is going to use missiles and attack every base on your territory. You will find yourself a permanent enemy of the big neighbor next door, which isn't going to go away and has a very long memory. I think that's going to cause both those countries to think very, very hard about what they would do in a conflict. Both of them are vindicated their concern over stability and peace in the Taiwan Strait, but that doesn't mean they're prepared to go to war over it. And I think this is the area which is going to be great complexity for the U.S. and its allies, which the U.S. at this stage, I think, expects that its friends will be with it in a war with China. After all, it's defended both South Korea and Japan for 70 odd years or more, since World War II or since the Korean War. So from an American standpoint, not to have its allies with it would be taken very badly. On the other hand, from the standpoint of both Tokyo and Seoul, national survival would suggest staying out of the way of a war with China, especially if it's over something that neither side views as quite existential for their own survival. So this is an area that the allies are going to have to be talking about and working out, in the future. And one of the other problems the U.S. has is the president keeps saying things that his aides keep saying aren't U.S. policy, but nobody really believes it. The president for the fourth time has said the U.S. would defend Taiwan. And his aides then immediately show up and hold a press conference and say, oh, no, he didn't mean that. Didn't change US policy. There is no policy change. But quite honestly, if you're in Beijing at this stage, that doesn't mean anything to you. If the president 4 times has said the US, at least under him, will intervene militarily in Taiwan, the US will intervene militarily in Taiwan. So that really does change planning, for Taiwan. And that is another issue that if the US is prepared to do that, number one is the president needs a declaration of war if he's going to go to war with China over Taiwan. And the second is, frankly, somebody in Washington needs to level with the American people about what that would mean. This would not be Iraq. This would not be Afghanistan. This wouldn't be sending weapons to Ukraine. This would be a full-on conventional war with a major power, both of which, powers have nuclear weapons, where in the heat of battle, we have never had a major conventional war among great powers that were nuclear armed. Who knows how this goes? And if either side starts losing, the temptation to use nuclear weapons would be there. The US would have to attack mainland bases. I mean, if China is using mainland bases in a war over Taiwan, the US would have to go after them. But of course, if you attack the mainland, that almost certainly forces China to escalate. At the very least, I think China would be going after Guam, Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, which are American territories. And if South Korea and Japan got in the war, I mean, China would be going after the bases on Okinawa, the military Marine Expeditionary Forces there, Tokyo Bay, other things. So one can imagine the escalation here that could get very, very dangerous. So this is something where policymakers in Washington, if they were prepared to go down this path, at some point need to make clear to the American people and essentially consult them. And are Americans going to be there for a major conventional war over Taiwan? Is that something that Americans are prepared to fight over and commit to? This wouldn't necessarily be quick, and it wouldn't necessarily be just one war. I mean, imagine American victory. That doesn't mean China goes away. It probably means that China decides to rearm and go for another round. But I think that the Taiwan issue is a huge one that we are going to be dealing with that brings in a lot of Chinese issues. I mean, the US is dealing with issues over industrial policy and semiconductor chips, issues of human rights. I mean, a lot of other issues are coming in there, as well as South China Sea territorial issues. But Taiwan, I think, is the real flashpoint at the moment on the Chinese side. In terms of both Japan and South Korea, one of the big issues for America is having Seoul and Tokyo themselves have better relations with one another. President Yoon in Seoul appears to be committed very strongly to wanting to improve that relationship. But this is difficult. I mean, the Japanese are not happy with court rulings and threats to take property of Japanese companies. I mean, there's history here. This is a relationship that has been very difficult since the colonial rule by Japan. The US has pressed in the past, hoping to get an improved relationship. Under the previous South Korean administration, things didn't improve. They got worse. The fact that President Yoon is committed to this is very important. The problem on the Japanese side is it's not clear that Prime Minister Kishida is as committed, and he has his own political problems. A lot of question about how strong he is these days. It's all domestic. It doesn't really have anything directly to do with South Korea, but it has an impact on what he can sell and what he can make as policy, what concessions he can make. And this is an issue that, from an American standpoint, from an allied standpoint of other countries in the region, it makes eminent sense for South Korea and Japan to cooperate, to work together. They're both democratic, they're capitalists, they're allies of America. They should be working together when it comes to North Korea and when it comes to China in particular. So that's another issue of extraordinary importance for the US. And we'll see if the Biden administration is able to make progress. These issues are not easy to resolve. Americans come into this and find the whole issue of history kind of, why are you bothering about this? It's, 100 years ago, 70 years ago. But of course, these are emotional issues that matter hugely to the people involved. The question then is how to get by them, how to be able to put accept the history, to make accommodations, to put them aside. We don't have a good answer to that, but that's an issue which absolutely is going to have to be addressed. And of course, there's always the fun issue of North Korea. At the moment, one of the problems is North Korea doesn't want to talk to anybody. That in the past, Sometimes the issue was North Korea was frustrated that nobody would talk to it. They wanted to talk. Now everybody wants to talk to it. It doesn't want to talk. And this really goes back to 2019, February 2019, the Hanoi summit blew up. After that, for the most part, North Korea withdrew from most contact with both the US and South Korea. It went so far as to blow up the liaison building, built at some significant expense by South Korea to demonstrate how badly it didn't want to talk. The Biden administration has made very clear it would like to have negotiations, have diplomatic contact. North Korea has just utterly dismissed those. Very dismissive of the Moon administration, has shown no more interest in talking to the Yoon administration. Was very dismissive of Yoon administration's proposal in terms of kind of its extraordinary proposal for aid and try to moving forward in terms of development with the North. So if the North Korea is not talking, then what happens? Well, of course, the problem is North Korea has been very busy missile testing, and everyone's waiting for a seventh nuclear test. Now, they haven't done that yet, despite all the presuppositions, and that may be because they're concerned about the Chinese reaction. Nevertheless, there's a fairly strong assumption among people who deal with Korea that at some point they're going to come up with another one. That basically Kim Jong-un is committed to creating a recognizable deterrent against America. That is the ability to fire missiles and target American cities. It's not enough to theoretically be able to hit North America. The question is, can you actually target something with some reliability? And there are estimates out there from Rand Corporation, Cato Institute, and others that talk about a North Korea that in a few years could have 100, 200 or more nuclear weapons. That we could be talking about a North Korea that has an arsenal alongside those of, say, Pakistan or India, bigger than that of Israel. And that would be extraordinarily significant and would transform the security equation in Northeast Asia. So the question is, if North Korea won't talk and is at the moment committed to simply building, what to do? And the Allied answer has always been sanctions, but sanctions aren't likely to get us very far. After all, North Korea essentially self-sanctioned itself, under COVID, and still very strong restrictions on them. Apparently, it's reopened trade with China. If it's willing to sanction itself and it survives even after essentially sanctioning itself, Allied sanctions, even piling more on, aren't likely to do much, especially because no one really believes Russia and China are going to be terribly helpful these days. Their relationship with the United States, most importantly, is very bad, both of them. And both of them are much more likely to see North Korea as a useful weapon against the United States and its allies than be prepared to make concessions, make compromises to try to get a settlement here that would be seen primarily as beneficial to the US, and especially from a Chinese standpoint. The long term, they really don't want a unified Korea allied with America. They don't want dangers of implosion. They've long been very hesitant to put too much pressure on the North. At this stage, I don't think we can count on much help from either, Beijing or Moscow. So then if sanctions aren't an answer, well, military action isn't. If we were afraid to take military action decades ago when the North, basically it was limited to artillery that could destroy Seoul and launch a suicidal, conventional attack, to being able to drop nuclear weapons kind of all over East Asia and maybe on America. We're not going to go to war over that. We're simply not going to take that kind of a chance. So we've got to decide how to address a North Korea under those circumstances. What do the North Koreans want? And that's going to require allied consultation. We seem to be living in a world in which the only answer, frankly, is arms control. That is, most people I talk to in this field do not believe North Korea will give up nuclear weapons. And I certainly don't. Estimates now, some of the estimates run up to 60 or 65 nukes, or at least theoretically having enough plutonium, enough fuel to make that many weapons. We don't know what they have. At that stage, it's very hard to imagine them ever walking back. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but we also have to think realistically in the question of how do you engage them? How do we get them talking? What are the negotiations? The starting point at this point may simply be to try to limit them. Get into some limits that would probably require making some sanctions relief. This is going to require discussions with the US, with South Korea, with Japan, how to proceed together, how to try to move forward on this extraordinarily difficult agenda, that we have. Because in North Korea, imagine a North Korea with 150 nuclear weapons. Imagine a North Korea with missiles that could hit, for the most part, most targets in the United States, certainly in the western part of it, at least to the US. This would be a very different world in terms of security. It would raise real issues of the US-South Korean alliance. Is the US prepared to have extended deterrence that is promising to defend South Korea with nuclear weapons if the result of the war means that North Korea could actually destroy American cities? Are the American people prepared to risk Los Angeles, Seattle, Chicago, whatever, Honolulu, to protect Seoul, Busan, and elsewhere? It's not clear to me they would. Now, the Pentagon and people in authority say, of course. On the other hand, this is one of those moments the American people might say, no, thank you. We really don't want to be drawn into something like that. So this is another issue that's going to have to be discussed, is what kind of a nuclear commitment does the U.S. have? And if the U.S. doesn't want to maintain a nuclear umbrella, then that brings up the whole question about South Korean nuclear weapons, which is an issue that's been talked about in the past. Polls suggest the majority of South Koreans would like that, or at least they might view that as the second best, but it's the best they can get. And it ties into the issue of nuclear negotiations with North Korea. If North Korea won't negotiate and continues to build, at what point do South Koreans decide that the only answer is to have something? And of course, if South Korea did so, then Japan would probably want that as well. So suddenly, we have to start thinking in these terms in the future, so we're not surprised. Excuse me. We need to kind of try to get ahead of these issues as opposed to have something blow up, perhaps literally, and then have to figure out what to do about it. What position should the U.S. take? What position should its allies take, on these issues? And of course, all of this is happening now in the midst of this horrid war of Russia against Ukraine. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine anyone who doesn't, feel sympathy for Ukraine and hope that Ukraine is able to defend off Russia. So far it's done extraordinarily well. With the recent counterattacks, I think there's great hope that Russia will figure out that it simply cannot, win this war. The problem, of course, is the longer the war goes on, the greater the destruction. There's hope in Ukraine for regaining all lost territory. Not clear they can do that. And the question is at what risk and how long do they want to do that? But what this also does is shows some of the very important divisions in the world that complicate some of these issues. While the US and Europeans, plus South Korea, Japan, Australia, and some of its friends in Asia, are almost united in terms of sanctions against Russia, most of the global South is not. The 10 most populous countries on earth, only one of them has put sanctions on Russia. That's the US. China has not, India has not, Indonesia has not. You go down the list of Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, Pakistan. You don't find these countries racing off and taking the allied position. And that should be sobering for the West. Should recognize that the US and Europeans obviously have lost a certain amount of the leadership they once had. They've lost some of the moral luster, in the sense of the allies is not there. Quite frankly, these are countries that look, especially in America, what happened in, say, Iraq, and are not so willing to follow American lead on some of these issues. They also, these are countries that have great economic needs. They're not interested in kind of hurting themselves on energy, cutting off poor people from access to food and other things. So this is another one of those critical issues, which, if you look at a map, you figure Ukraine, Russia is primarily a European issue. And in military terms, it is. But the economic impacts are widespread around the world. And we're seeing these political impacts as well. They're going to require, I think, some rethinking in Brussels and Washington, and a recognition that how do you appeal to countries in the global South on issues like this, that if you're going forward in the future, you cannot assume that you can just kind of make some pronouncement and the world will follow you. We found that's not happening here. And that matters a lot, because if there's a war with, between China and Taiwan, and the US wants to get involved, it wants everybody to be behind it. Well, this suggests maybe the world won't be behind it. that a lot of these countries might probably take the same stance, simply stay out of it, not get in the way, certainly not lose trade relations and other things with China. So this is another one of those issues that I think deserves to, have some very substantial attention in terms of where we're going in the world.
Well, I hope you enjoy those insights. Welcome back. And as you can see, it's an incredibly complex situation in the Pacific, as of course in many other parts of the world. But we hope through dialogue and trying to understand the situation and circumstances better that we can help resolve some of these issues. So that was part one, and we're going to have a part two also following up with Mr. Bandow and also the president internationally of the Universal Peace Federation, Dr. Michael Jenkins. So please watch that episode as well. And at IMAP, I had mentioned about universal values that we're trying to achieve, and we have what we call principles of peace, and I'd like to just briefly mention those. 1, we are one human family created by God. Number 2, the highest qualities of the human being are spiritual and moral in nature. The family is the school of love and peace. Living for the sake of others is the way to reconcile the divided human family. And number 5, peace comes through cooperation beyond the boundaries of ethnicity, religion, and nationality. So thank you for joining our program today. We have webinars every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you go to our website, it's us.upf.org, you'll see a list of all the events. We have different topics each week. And as always, I like to offer the biographies of our founders, our co-founders, Reverend Sun Myung Moon and his wife, Dr. Hak Jahan Moon. If anyone is interested, please get in touch with one of us. So thank you for joining us today.